Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to be talking more about the abolition movement and its impact on the United States. Many free African Americans worked together to establish churches and schools. Some acted to try to change and improve the lives of enslaved African Americans. In Boston, a free African American named David Walker published a pamphlet that used religion as the base for a blistering attack on slavery. And here's a quote from that pamphlet. "You may do your best to keep us in wretchedness and misery, to enrich you and your children, but God will deliver us from under you. Treat us then like men, and we will be your friends. And there is no doubt in my mind but that the whole of the past will be sunk into oblivion, and we yet under God will become a united and happy people. The whites may say it is impossible, but remember that nothing is impossible with God." David Walker, Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, 1829. Walker's pamphlet was outlawed in the slave-holding South. Still, it reached a wide audience in the North, where more people were beginning to view slavery as fundamentally incompatible with the religious views that they embraced during the Second Great Awakening. Remember, this is right after the Second Great Awakening, where there was this huge religious movements and all of these reforms about making society more fair and equitable. Well, now people are starting to see just how evil slavery is, and they're realizing that we got to do something about this because this is not compatible with our religious views. This is a certificate of membership in the American Colonization Society. Misgivings about slavery have been spreading across the nation since Revolutionary times. Many Northerners objected to it on moral grounds. By 1804, all states north of Maryland had passed legislation to end slavery. In 1807, bringing new slaves to any part of the United States from Africa was banned. Still, slavery was an established institution in the South, where slave labor played an important role in the economy. So it was illegal to bring new slaves to the United States from Africa. That was illegal. That was banned at this time. However, unlike slavery in West Africa, in the United States, if you were a child and you were born and your parents were slaves, you were a slave. You were born a slave. You were born the property of your parents' master. So that's how they still had slaves, even though they couldn't bring in any new ones. Whenever slaves would have children, those children were slaves. From the moment they were born, they were slaves. So that's how there were still slaves around, even though it was illegal to bring in new slaves from Africa. Anti-slavery activists like these in Virginia faced violence from supporters of slavery. Abolitionists demand emancipation. By the early 1800s, a growing number of Americans opposed to slavery began to speak out because they wanted slavery abolished or ended. They became known as abolitionists. The great reform movement they led was the Abolition Movement. And this man here is one of the most famous abolitionists. A printer named William Lloyd Garrison, who lived in Boston, Massachusetts, became one of the leading abolitionists. Garrison began his anti-slavery career by working for Benjamin Lundy, a Baltimore Quaker who published America's first anti-slavery newspaper. In 1831, Garrison began publishing his own anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. Garrison used dramatic language to attract readers and convince them that slavery was morally wrong. The Liberator. Garrison was in favor of emancipation, or the freeing of enslaved people. At first, he thought, like most abolitionists, that this should be accomplished gradually over time to minimize economic and social disruption. But Garrison soon took the radical step of advocating immediate emancipation and the extension of full political and social rights to African Americans. In cities across the Northeast and the Midwest, abolitionist societies made up of people who shared Garrison's views sprang up. Founded by Garrison in 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society had over 150,000 members nationally by 1840. That's a lot of people for a society that was only around for 7 years. This group printed anti-slavery pamphlets and distributed them to churches and other community organizations. The American Anti-Slavery Society and similar groups also supported a team of hundreds of lecturers who spoke against slavery at camp meetings and other public gatherings. They insisted that holding slaves was counter to most Americans' religious ideals. Once again, I'm bringing it back to the Second Great Awakening. A lot of people had this newly found religious fervor and zeal, and they are going to stick with that, and then they're realizing, well, slavery does not work with my religious feelings. Other abolitionist leaders. Theodore Weld, a student at the Lane Theological Seminary in Ohio, became another leading abolitionist. Weld shared Garrison's belief in the power of moral suasion. However, whereas Garrison resorted to public confrontation, Weld chose to work through the churches. Weld married Angelina Grimke, the daughter of a Southern slaveholder, who was so moved by the abolition movement that she went north to join it. She and her sister Sarah Grimke spoke and wrote against slavery. Another well-known abolitionist, and arguably the most eloquent, was Frederick Douglass, a former slave whose booming voice filled lecture halls with touching stories about the difficulty of his life as a slave. Now, Frederick Douglass, that is going to be a name that you're going to hear again in the future. He is a major abolitionist. He is a former slave himself, and he filled lecture halls. People would show up from all around to come hear him talk. And it's truly amazing because he was an African American. And even though a lot of people were against slavery, and they were against, keeping slavery around, a lot of them were still very racist and very prejudiced against African Americans. So the fact that people would show up and he would fill these gathering halls and lecture halls and public spaces to hear him speak really kind of reinforces just how revolutionary this guy was. Backlash against abolition. Despite the growing call of abolitionists, most Americans continued to support slavery. The voices against abolition came from both the slave states of the South and the free states of the North. Many Southerners opposed abolitionism. This illustration shows the burning of abolitionist newspapers by South Carolina slavery supporters in 1835. So as you can see here, even not only did these people support slavery, but they would go out and attack and burn newspapers and businesses that supported abolition. Southerners defend slavery. As abolitionists were developing their arguments against slavery, Southern slaveholders intensified their arguments in support of it. They publicized their conviction that slavery was necessary because it would form the foundation of the South's agricultural economy. Moreover, they argued slavery benefited the North since the North's textile and shipping industries depended upon Southern cotton. They further maintained that a slave labor force was superior to the wage labor force of the North. They argued that Northern employers and laborers would be inevitably at odds since employers wanted workers to work more for less money, while workers wanted to work less for more money. So they're trying to find these ways to get the North to come back and support slavery. The southern part of the country was heavily invested in having slaves due to these massive plantations that they had, and they needed all these people to work the fields for them. So, whenever they saw all this growing support to get rid of slavery, that was going to be very difficult for their businesses to deal with. So they're trying to get people in the North to come back and support slavery. Slaveholders maintained that in contrast, such conflict was avoided in the South, where the well-being of slaves depended on their slaveholders' fortunes, and slaveholders' fortunes depended on the well-being of their slaves. But some Southerners went even further, claiming that the Bible supported slavery, that enslaved people could not survive without slaveholders, and that the enslavement of Africans was historically inevitable. Such assertions were clearly racist, but many people of the time believed them. So we're seeing a lot of different opinions coming out. But the thing that keeps coming back up is the South is desperately trying to cling to hang on to slavery. As abolitionist rhetoric grew more strident, Southern support for gradual manumission or freeing of slaves decreased. Southern spokespeople stepped up their arguments about the value of slavery, and Southern slaveholders tried to prevent Southerners from reading abolitionist publications. Post offices refused to deliver abolitionist newspapers. Southerners, even many of those who did not own slaves, embraced slavery as their preferred way of life, to be defended at all costs. So, while the North is trying to influence people to be against slavery and to be for emancipation and freeing of the slaves, the South is doing everything they can to defend slavery, even trying to convince people who weren't slaveholders themselves that they should support slavery because it supported their way of life. There was resistance to abolition in the North as well. Southerners were not alone in their resistance to abolition. Most Northerners agreed with them. In Boston in 1835, Garrison was chased through the streets by an angry mob as a result of his anti-slavery views. In Philadelphia in 1838, the Grimke-Weld wedding, attended by both white and African-American guests, so infuriated local residents that they burned down the anti-slavery meeting hall. In Alton, Illinois, irate crowds destroyed abolitionist newspaper editor Elijah Lovejoy's printing press several times, killing Lovejoy himself in 1837. In city after city, white workers, fearing African-American competitors would take their jobs, launched stiff resistance to abolition. Wealthy industrialists resented the presence of African-American entrepreneurs in their midst. They also worried that the end of slavery would cut off the supply of Southern cotton for Northern textile mills. So we're seeing that there is resistance to abolition all over the place. While it is focused primarily in the South, there are people in the North who are against abolition as well. The gag rule. Many white Northerners were biased against Southern politicians and institutions, but they did not want to wrestle with the problems of African Americans either. They wanted to stay out of the controversy about slavery. When Southern politicians pushed a gag rule, a law which prohibited debate and discussion in Congress on the subject of slavery, some Northerners supported them. First passed in 1836, the gag rule was renewed annually for 8 years. So for 8 years, there was this rule in place in Congress where they wouldn't even discuss slavery. They would not bring it up. It would not be ruled upon. There would be no debate. There would be no discussion about slavery. And they did this for 8 years. Slavery divides the nation. Although the abolition movement remained small and mostly confined to the North, it was vocal and persistent. The debate over slavery divided Americans like no other issue. It widened regional cultural differences between the largely urban and industrialized North and the largely rural and agricultural South. Indeed, the divisive issue of slavery would soon prove to be a major factor as the country began to break apart. So, and as we all know, this issue is going to lead to the Civil War. But that is going to be the end of this video. If you have any questions about anything we went over, you know how to get a hold of me. You can message me through Schoology, leave a comment, email, however you need to get a hold of me if you have any questions. I hope everybody's having a great day, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye.